One day, wandering around that hospital and hospital grounds, I disappeared from that era and from 2137, and I wound up in a still further future date. By what means, who arranged it, who provided the transportation, I don't know. It was obviously a form of time travel. The interesting thing about it was that Duncan was not with me. He remained behind at 2137, as I found out later. I wound up in the 28th century, and this was in a time period of 2749 to 2751 AD. Talk about changes in civilization, society, and everything else. It was drastically changed from what we saw in 2137, as this is now 600 years later. The cities were enormous. The cities were beautiful. They had ground-based cities, much as we have always had them, but they also had something else, floating cities. Floating cities, due to anti-gravity techniques being perfected sufficiently that they could float an entire city, which was perhaps not as large as any of our current cities. It was round, or very nearly round, but it floated on this platform, and they could move the city any place they wanted, remaining floating in the air, 4,000 or 5,000 feet above the ground, perhaps, or a little less, depending on what they wanted. But the size of the city was vertical rather than horizontal, 2,200 stories high. That's about 2.5 miles. And I learned about this and looked at this, and I said to myself, because I befriended some people in the 28th century, how do they support this? The strength of materials, anything we know, and I'm sure in this era, is inadequate to withstand the load of all of those stories above the ground of the lowest level. And I said, quite true. I said, well, how do you do it? And I says, well, very simply, it's about every 300 floors, we put another anti-gravity platform which relieves the weight of all of those sections above on the section below, and they do this for every 300 stories or so, and you break it up into 300-story sections, which is not impossible by even today's strength of materials, but by future strength of materials and advances, no problem whatever. So they would divide it up, and the weight load was only on one level, and then below it was independent in terms of load, though they were all well attached. And by that means, they suspended the load into a distributed form, which made it very feasible. The cities could move anywhere on the planet. Basically, they stayed hovering and floating. Or if they didn't like a particular location, they moved somewhere else. There wasn't that much traffic in moving cities, I can assure you, because the world population in that era, the 28th century, was only 500 million, and I was instructed later that that was where they had held it for centuries. There would be no more than approximately 500 million population. Some of the features of this, let's start from the political standpoint. As I learned, all of these cities, whether they're ground-based cities, which the majority were, because they had to do manufacturing, they had to have agriculture and various other things to supply the needs of civilization. But all of them, whether floating or ground-based, were rather interesting in their governmental form. They had essentially no government. There was no government as we know it today. There was no money, there was no banks, there was no political jurisdictions, and it resolved down to what would be best called a city-state structure, where the city is the state. And any other cities from that one are independent and operate in their own independent manner. So that was the major change there. There was no elected government. There was no appointed government. There was no government as we had ever seen it in the past. As I found out, each city was run by an intelligent computer, synthetic intelligence, synthetic consciousness, a highly radioactive crystalline structure. Who built them, I had no idea. Nobody seemed to know, but they've been there for hundreds of years. And this computer ran the entire city. There were guidelines set down, there were law books, but no courts. There were guidelines set down as to how you're to behave, what your parameters were. Within these parameters, anything went. Anything was not considered kosher within this realm, this parameter limit, would be expressed as a yellow zone, a zone that you don't want to go into and you don't want to become involved in that type of behavior. If you got out into that area, you were given an invite for a reprimand to the computer, which there was one in every city, running each city. You would literally be called in for, shall we say, an interview or an audience with the computer, and you would be advised that you had broken the law, but it wasn't considered a felony, it was a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor and such. If you were judged guilty, you were sent off to one of the work camps for whatever purpose they did in the work camps. It would be much like today, I presume, where any kind of labor, menial or otherwise, had to be done was done. And that was compulsory. That was not voluntary. If you were called in because you had gone outside the yellow zone into what is called the red zone, which is basically what you would today call a felony offense, you were immediately called in for an interview. You were examined, looked at, talked to, and if the computer at that point thought that you were rehabilitable, that you could learn again to be sociable and within the social bounds of normalcy, you were given one more chance. If the computer decided that you were not capable of fitting into society, you were terminated right then and there. Now, there were other people who didn't feel like they could fit into the society, but had not yet committed any of the so-called offenses. Literally, they were allowed to leave. If the word was, if you don't like it here, go live somewhere else. Go out in the boonies if you want. Live as a hermit. We don't care. And many did. I do not know what percentage. I was told that quite a lot of people had left the cities and gone out in the boondocks. Whether they formed communities or not, I never did find out. The technology was so advanced on that you had, for transportation within the city, what they called accelerons. Consider it very much like a moving walkway as we have today, except that when you got on it, you could literally jump ahead and move in a form of suspended gravity at a very high rate of speed along this beltway. And when you got to a point where you wanted to get off, you just literally jumped off. And the kids loved to play with this sort of toy. They considered it a toy. To some extent, they were always getting in the way, but to them it was great fun. As these accelerons went across, even in the sky cities, across open spaces. In the interior of the city structure, there was a fairly large open space. Eventually, I got my turn to talk with the computer. It was part of what was called the Llama systems. Now, why that name was chosen, I don't know. But it was a fact that every one of those computer installations, though independent, was tied together on a network not known by most of the city dwellers, which included every city on the planet. So that there was cohesion between the computers, cooperation, and generally they kept track of each other. I spent almost 2 years in this very large complex. I traveled around a lot. One of the other things was, yes, there were railroads, but they had changed a lot. They were now for the purpose of excursion, having fun. And go out on one of these excursions, was a big party. The rail was much wider than our current rail system, perhaps 2 to 2.5 times wider to accommodate a much larger car, much wider. And with that, of course, they had literally rolling dining rooms, rolling ballrooms, and could have a great time and great fun, literally traveling from one city to the other with no other purpose other than having fun and taking a trip somewhere. If you weren't required to work, which no one was required to, other than their social obligation, which was well inculcated into the kids, that you had an obligation to contribute to society, to pay for what you have been using and had inherited, for which no money was involved. A sort of credit system was still functional, but otherwise, except for fairly large credit purchases, if that is the right term, they didn't really keep track of very much. It was considered quite free as long as you were able to make some contributions and nobody overloaded the system with demands. That happened very seldom, that there was an overload of demand for goods or services. So as a result of that, there was very little abuse of the system. Now, in this period of time, talking with many people, making friends, I had a number of questions. Who built this computer system? That was my first and foremost question. Who maintains it? What happens when it breaks down? Very common questions. No common answer. And very much uncommon answers. First question about the cities, who built them, who maintains them, who maintains the computers, was rather hard to answer and get an answer to. No one really knew much about the history of the construction of the city or how it ran, other than the computer, and you couldn't request an interview. You could request to go in and ask questions. If it wasn't busy with something else, okay, come on in. But understanding, of course, that this was a highly radioactive device, it was a radioactive crystalline structure, you had to wear the equivalent of a lead suit, a radiation suit, much like NASA has today, except there was some lead material added to make sure that you were not affected by the hard radiation. So you could go in and have an interview and ask a lot of questions, and I did more than once. I got some answers. I would say they were always satisfactory. But I did find out eventually that a number of interesting things. While there was no longer a military, and I'm speaking of the 28th century, in any of the city structures and any of the data information of this computer complex, because they did interconnect and did just like an email net or another computer complex, there were a lot of people on the line giving information and taking information. The aspect of how these computers communicated with each other was unknown. But it did make, the one I talked with did make a number of interesting statements over a period of time. They had been around for about 250 years in this format and this system. There was no one to do any maintenance. Apparently there was no maintenance as such. If one of them broke down, it was simply replaced. But I wasn't satisfied with some of these answers. I started looking further didn't find much for a while. Then all of a sudden I got an invite to come visit with another group, a human group, which I did. And then I found the answers to all of my questions. All of the questions I had in mind, they were able to answer. Number one, who built the computer system? Well, they said they did. And the project was started about 2600 AD, and it was basically an experimental system for the purpose of seeing if they could run an entire civilization by computer, and also provide full socialization, i.e. everything is free, but also in the educational system or process inculcate the idea that people have a moral obligation to do something for the community because the community had supported them, therefore they have to help support others in the community, which did work most of the time. In a smaller community, it works much better than in a larger community. If you get cities of well over 1 million population, it's very difficult to get something like this to work and to be usable on a consistent basis. Well, that was one of the questions I had. There were a lot of others. I asked about the military aspects. No, there was no more military. Well, how do you defend yourself in case somebody comes along, has a lot of hardware, a lot of munitions, a lot of military clout, and wants to take over a city or the whole planet? How do you prevent this? Or do you? Well, the answer was rather complex, but basically it came down to the fact that they had hidden weapon systems in the cities. And not every installation was a city, but they had all of these installations all over. And they were well concealed. They were not described to me as exactly what they were, but they said they were capable of deflecting and defending a city from an invasion from outer space. And there was no data given as to whether or not there had been any such attempted takeovers in the past. But at that time, we saw nothing resembling any kind of an attack, any kind of a threat. It was very peaceful. And it's perhaps because of that peacefulness that people were basically so happy there. It was, you might say, the end result of a long dream about a pure socialist state. They had it, and it seemed to work. There's only one fault with it that I saw, and this is something which I have discerned since I've been back, after many years. You get a city or a group which is purely socialistic, no money. How do you keep that group together? How do you keep the society together? In that case, you're looking at a situation where it's partly by the will of the people, partly by, shall I say, some kind of internal control, and partly because one could say there's no little choice. If you don't want to live in a city, you go out in the boonies. If you don't know how to survive by yourself, you stay in the city. Survival skills were not something that was commonly taught in those days because all the technical problems of breakdown of equipment have long since been solved, and the equipments generally were working and continue to work for about 200 years without much maintenance. The maintenance was required was definitely directed by the intelligence in the computer. Systems existed for doing repairs and maintenance. And of course, if they had manufacturing systems, they had to have maintenance systems to service the manufacturing equipments. All of what was manufactured, I don't know. There was definitely a lot of agriculture. On the surface, in the periphery, basically, of some of the surface cities. Some of the agriculture went outside the city limits, outside the periphery of the city, but not a lot. They seemed to produce more than enough food for what they needed, which was good, because there was no problems or threats of food shortages. The idea of a threat to the survival in a civilized society had long since faded, because the people were so well cared for. But herein is also a problem. These people were well cared for by a socialist system. They didn't have to work to do anything, even though they were expected to work and expected to contribute to society. It was not demanded. The things I saw in this society and civilization were at first unique to me, and I would say not only without precedent, I had no comparison, no basis from the memories of the 20th century, because at the time of my arrival, my memory of the 20th century was wiped out. All of the comparisons I have done have come since because at this point I'm able to compare what I saw at that time with what I know, of course, of the 20th century. But it was sort of strange in that I didn't know really why I was there. I didn't know that I had any connection with the Philadelphia experiment or anything else in the past. But there I was, running around the city as one of the regular inhabitants, occasionally taking trips out of the city, which were a lot of fun, and meeting this group who built the computer system. Now, as they told me, this was an experimental system, a sort of an experiment in social behavior, not necessarily behavior modification, but social behavior to see whether they could build a city and have it be run by a computer after setting down certain parameters of what you do or don't do in a society in which you have a city, or even a smaller community. It was obvious to them, as it was to me, that the experiment was largely working. But my questions in retrospect, meaning from the viewpoint of now, and from what they told me also, yes, it is an experiment, but they do not know if it'll succeed. Because one of the problems which develops when you have pure socialism like that, which is working, in that everything seems to be running smoothly, you have no incentive. No one has an incentive to go out and do something new. Nobody has an incentive which says you must try something like this to make a better living, so to speak. You didn't have to make a living. Everything was provided. You didn't have to get an education. And this, of course, put at that point already a severe restriction on original research because people weren't interested in doing it. So they didn't. And eventually, the society appears, it fell apart. But certainly it was at its peak point, I would say, right around that time, 2900 AD, and probably was for some time after that. But the group that designed and built this system built all of the computer link-ups, and occasionally one would go bad, because I was there just before I left, for one had gone sour, and it was removed at a later date, I believe. But I did learn the name of this group of people who were essentially the designers of the whole system, the computer system, the city structures, the city setup. They call themselves the Wingmakers. Now, some of you may have heard of the Wingmakers group. It certainly has turned up on 20th century computers, 20th century runs, and a lot of data has been turned out, hundreds of pages in some of the manuals, describing the discovery of their stash in New Mexico in about 1974, in which the only thing they found which was out of place for an 8th century AD Indian burial mound, or Indian burial of whatever, the item that was totally out of context was a compass. It resulted in NSA becoming involved with this, descending on the site, sealing it off, and looking to see if possibly what they were looking at was actually an alien type of installation, an alien crash or whatever. They did not ever find any evidence of aliens. In fact, they didn't find enough evidence to support any thesis. So they closed it down, and after an earthquake in about the year 1994 approximately, a wall disappeared due to the earthquake, and they had a tunnel, an artificial-looking tunnel, which went to a circular staircase carved right in the rock, which was quite obviously artificial, and 23 rooms off that staircase in a long tunnel, all of which contained relics of some civilization that was advanced, paintings, and in the last room, the 23rd room, was a laser disc, an actual optical disc, much like what we have today, except the coding in it was such that it could not be decoded. Make a long story short, it took a year and a half for one of the experts there in languages, who knew 20 languages, and so ancient Sumerian, and somehow got the clues from the pictures on the walls, 23 rooms, 23 pictures, all paintings, and all in good shape. They finally cracked the optical disc, and they who had made the disc and left it there stated very clearly that they had left this stash in 800 AD approximately, 8th century, and there were 6 more like it around the earth, 7 total. The object was for man to dig these up when he got to the point where technically he could do it and understand what was there and learn their concerns about civilization. Well, one has been found. That was in New Mexico. There are 6 more. There are rumors that a second one has been found. But of course, the first one was totally under the control of NSA, National Security Agency. Underneath the basic organization was another one called ACIO, Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization. They are the ones who apparently pull all of the rare and exotic research involving finds which might look like aliens, but proved in this case not to be. It was a time travel operation. And that is the group which is set aside to do it, and there's a special group within ACIO known as the Wingmakers Group, which was working on this project and keeping it very, very secret. They identified the group that was as having come from the 28th century, originating in the 28th century. They called themselves the Wingmakers, which is what I remember, and they were interactive with this time period also. That is the 20th century into the 21st century. They did not give me any indication at the time when I was in the 20th century that they were interactive with the 20th century, but I got the distinct impression that I had not seen the last of them from the various things they said. I have not seen them since, I might add. Not in any physical sense, unless it was by accident, because there was no communication. And it might have been an instance where I saw some of their people, 3 of them, in a men's health club on one Sunday afternoon in Atlanta about 2 years ago. No communication with anyone, not even communicating between themselves. The group was telepathic. And whether it was them or not, I don't know, but I have a suspicion. They were too genetically perfect to have been of this time and this era, so they could have been. But since then, the indications have been via the internet and that information which was dropped on the net, 2 interviews out of 5 that have been given by Dr. Anderson, a pseudonym, but one of the senior workers with the language capability to crack the optical disc, found an outside person to take some interviews, 5 in all, and translate them into a material which could be put on the internet. He wanted the material out. Well, 2 got out, and some other material, and that was the last I've ever seen or heard of either Ann or Dr. Anderson. There's no answer at this point as to whether or not those 2 people are still alive or dead, what's happened to them, and the other 3 interviews have never appeared on the internet. There's enough that has appeared to make a very substantial story and a very substantial indications that these guys were not flakes. The section on philosophy alone is enough to really stir one, and the pictures are very, very strange. According to those who found them, on the walls, they were still in very good condition and repairs. This is from the 8th century to the 20th century, which is 1,200 years. And there was very little deterioration, and for that matter, there was very little dust in the rooms. But they found some means to protect them further. I mean, the CIA does have some rather advanced technologies available to them, and NSA. And they made some further attempt to preserve the paintings. What they did, I don't know. But what is interesting is that the other stashes have yet to turn up. And they insisted from this one optical disc that there were 6 more, and when the time was right, they'd all be found. They were very concerned about the survival of humanity throughout this very critical period of history, meaning the 20th century into the 21st century. Now, in retrospect, looking back at them and the things they said, and what I now remember, they were not convinced, in my view, that the socialist experiment was a success. It was a success to a very certain degree in terms of the local time period and the local era, and perhaps in terms of what problems had developed prior to their starting this experiment, i.e. the collapse of, or near collapse of civilization and trying to rebuild in the period after 2137, 22nd century, up through the 26th. I had no indication of the history in that period as to what transpired. Nothing was discussed with me. I got the impression that it was not exactly in very good shape. There may have been other problems that developed in the interim, but by that time of the 26th century, they got a handle on synthetic intelligence, and they decided to go ahead and rebuild civilization using what they called the Llama system, the system of intelligence, created in a crystalline form, consciously aware, and having certain other abilities which would normally be classed as metaphysical. These computers were able to do things which perhaps some of our best gurus would have trouble doing. Manipulation of matter, manipulation of time by these computers. So they were not unintelligent. They were very intelligent. But they had no ethics or morality as we understand them and as we use them. So my question to myself, or perhaps to anyone else, is, are these guys looking now, perhaps, for another solution? Obviously, we learned in this century that if there is no competitive spirit, if there is no desire to succeed, if there is no pressure on an individual to learn, to do something constructive, to succeed, to help build some little corner, a brick or two in our civilization, without that pressure, people don't do anything. And if you suddenly wind up in a situation where all of your needs and wants are granted for free, and you don't have to go out and work for them, you don't have to do something to go get them, you don't have to cut down trees, go out and skin animals for their furs to survive, but suddenly everything is handed to you on a silver platter. Yeah, at first it seems great, and will work for a while, but after a period of time, it's going to fall apart. And I think they were at the point where they were beginning to realize that this was going to happen. Now, from that point, after nearly 2 years, I was told I had to go back. And I says, go back where? What for? It says, well, you came out of the past, and there are certain problems back there that were unresolved, and you have to go back and solve them. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't at that point remember my involvement at the Philadelphia experiment. That was brainwash number 1, if you will. And the Lama, the local one, kept insisting, you must go back. And I said, I don't want to. He says, you will go back. And I did. But before I left, during that 2-year period, I met somebody who became a very close companion. He happened to be a tour guide because there were a lot of tours in those days. And tour guides, of course, were necessary to take people around and show them the sights and show them some of the old cities. New York City was a museum, if you will, as were some other of the old cities from the 20th century, those that survived. And they made very nice museums out of them. New York was sort of the model to show how people lived in the 20th century. A great deal of it, I did go on that tour, a great deal of it was still intact, most of Manhattan, not all of it. Brooklyn and Queens were essentially destroyed, and they didn't make any attempt to rebuild it because the destruction was too heavy. But the concrete and steel of New York, of Manhattan, and some of the other buildings adjacent to Manhattan survived, and what little damage there was repaired, and they made a very nice museum of it. You could go through it and tour it, see the underground subway systems. I don't think they were as I remember, they were not operational, but everything was there. Made a very interesting review of history from the standpoint of those of the 28th century. What we take for granted today, of course, they didn't. And at that point, I did not have my memory of the 20th century, but as time went on, it came back after I left the 28th century. They said I had to go back, so I was sent back. And of course, this raises the question, were they the ones who brought me up there in the first place? I certainly didn't have any hardware handy to do it. I certainly had no desire to go to the 28th century. I knew nothing about it. So I went back to 2137, and Duncan was there, and I was imbued with the idea we had to go back. I had no idea how we were going to go back, and I wasn't even sure at that point where. But we did go back. We were sent back to 1983. The early morning hours, approximately 2 a.m. of 12 August 1983, inside the chain link fence at Montauk Point. And this searchlight came down from a large helicopter, and MPs of quite a number came out and grabbed us and took us to the building where we boarded an elevator, went down below, and then of course met Dr. John von Neumann. At the point of our return, however, that is to 1983, a great deal of the memory of the other elements came back. At this point, I'm still not sure how much of it came back, but quite a bit of it did. And when we were returned to the Eldridge by the crew and the system at Montauk, nearly the time tunnel, and we're back in the Eldridge, and it was back in the harbor, and we wound up in I wound up in the 4-day Board of Inquiry. Duncan jumped overboard and went back to the later part of that century, the 20th century. But after giving my report, of course, I was not believed. In retrospect, I can understand why I was not believed. Because who in the year 1983 is going to believe a story about 1943 is going to believe a story about 1983, much less about further on in the future than that? It would be hard enough to understand 1983. It's only 40 years, but enormous changes took place, far more than would ever have been normally expected. And let us say the mental projection of what comes on after 1943. Nobody expected such rapid development of aircraft, of automobiles, of highways, of freeway systems, of electronics, of computers. Of course, in 1983, computers were not in the form to any extent of personal computers, as is today the case in the year 2000. But nevertheless, computers existed, and they were proliferating in every way and every respect. But then to add a story about 2137. I'm sure that was a little bit too much. They thought I was a little bit ill and I had gotten some radiation sickness. Nobody said that because I gave a very coherent report, but I'm sure they might well have been thinking it. Duncan was not there to back me up, unfortunately, and he went on back to the year 1983, late 82, early 83. We're not sure. I say I'm not sure because those records we didn't dig out until after the Montauk Project collapsed. And it was in the 90s, 95, 96, we were able to find out what happened to Duncan. The rest of the story of Duncan we were able to finally piece together was rather bizarre in its own way. When Duncan and I were sent back to the Eldridge to destroy the equipment, which we did, and the fields were collapsing, it took over 2 minutes for them to totally collapse, and we found the 2 sailors buried in the steel of a deck and the steel of a bulkhead for the other 2. And I went over to talk with Brother Jim, who was crying and dying and did die. Duncan became so dismayed by all of this that he headed for the railing and looked back at me like, well, aren't I coming along with him? And I replied no. So he jumped overboard. And as we found out later, he wound up back at Montauk, not at the same point in time, 12 August 83, but considerably earlier, and became part of the project and did a lot of work for them. The records indicated, that is the records after the year 1983, that in one of the time tunnel operations that he was involved in, he did a no-no, something that was strictly forbidden, is that for reasons they didn't understand, occasionally side tunnels developed. And their orders were never to go down the side tunnels because they didn't know why they were created, how they were created, or where they went. And the order was, don't take a chance, don't go down them. Well, you don't say that to Duncan, not as he was then. So he did go down with the side tunnels and wound up in the hands of aliens. And they demanded of him that we want a certain piece of hardware, like what? Now they told him there's a certain power package, a crystal, aboard that UFO, which is buried in the underground there as part of the Montauk Project. We want that crystal back. And Duncan says, well, I don't have anything to do with it. I says, well, you will go back and get it, or you will send somebody back to get it. And frankly, we'll just keep you here and hope that somebody finds out you're missing and sends another person here, and we'll give them the message. So eventually the message got back at Duncan had a problem, and that the solution was to remove that large crystal, an energy storage crystal, in the UFO. It was delivered there, and Duncan was released. But by that time, the damage had been done. His time locks had been broken, and he was aging at an extremely rapid rate. Now, you may ask, what is a time lock? We're referring to that ambiguous item which involves how is a person, a new soul, or an old soul, doesn't matter, that is taking possession of a body that is in the process of being generated from the fetus onward. How do they lock into that particular body? Well, there is a connecting link, but there's also a connecting link to that point in the time stream as the reference point that this is where the person's life begins, both physically and in terms of the attachment of the soul. When the body's gone and the soul is free, they can travel up and down the time stream if they want to and take a body at some other time frame than the next slot, so to speak, after they died. And occasionally this happens. But in any case, Duncan wound up dying slowly but surely, aging very rapidly. The station personnel and those who were able to do age reversal and already had that equipment there because they used it on me later, apparently couldn't reverse him fast enough to keep it from overwhelming them, and in spite of their best efforts, he was continuing to age. So time tunneled to the rescue, namely Montauk, back to locate Father and warn him and tell him that Duncan was dying. You can't have this happen because of the time stability problems. Get busy and make another Duncan. So he married his fifth wife, a legal marriage. First child born was a sister, and the second one was Duncan. That was in June 28th, 1951. Now, for some very complex reasons, the soul of Duncan could not enter that body directly at that time of birth. Normally, that's what happens, as most of the time. Could not, so they had to have a surrogate soul. And as a surrogate soul was found to inhabit that body as a perfectly normal functioning body, which it did. And Duncan, number 2, went to school, acted like a very bright youngster. I have pictures of him in that age at that time. Duncan does not want them to be shown publicly now. And he grew up to the age of 12. And according to information acquired later, at the age of 12, on the 12th of August, 1963, the surrogate soul was kicked out and the real Duncan came in. His mother had reported a very sharp change in the personality in the time period of the age of 12 in July, August. That, of course, didn't mean anything to us until it was like reverse engineering. We reverse engineered what happened to Duncan. And we found out, rather in a strange but actually very conclusive way, when the project collapsed in 1983, Duncan was off of it, I was off it, Preston, many other people. But Duncan had a lot of psychological problems as a result of his involvement with the Montauk Project and the Montauk Boys. And eventually he came to seek help from someone he was told could help him, namely Preston Nichols. Now at this point, of course, he had been brainwashed, that is, debriefed, just as had Preston, as had I, as had everybody else who survived that operation. And he didn't know Preston when he walked in the door. Preston didn't know Duncan. But he says, first of all, he had some hi-fi equipment he wanted fixed, which Preston was in the business of doing. And then a matter of discussions that went on after that point. Preston asked him a few questions and says, well, it sounds like you have some problems. If you're willing, we'll try some deprogramming and we'll try some hypnosis on you. So about 1986, he hypnotized Duncan and took him back gradually from the period of the Montauk Project to the age of 12, in which everything seemed to be normal as going to be expected, hung together, and so forth. Then they took Duncan back and said, let's go earlier. Well, they did a quantum leap jump to the decks of the Eldridge. This is what was reported to me by Preston after the hypnosis session. And was on the deck, and he says, I'm on some strange ship called the Eldridge, and so there are people here that I know today. And I says, one of them is Al Bielek, and they named some others, it didn't mean anything to me. And the aspects of the Montauk Boys program. But at least we had determined what had happened to the Duncan we knew, that I met at that time as Al Bielek, was essentially the same Duncan, except that there was a body change. And by the same father, the body came out very nearly the same, a different mother. But that was a long and harrowing experience trying to dig all that out, and we did. Preston, of course, was having problems with his own memories, and to this day he has asked for help, and he says, I don't know anybody that can deprogram me. I can deprogram everybody else, but who's going to deprogram me? He says, I want to get clear of this also. That was a very interesting statement on his part, and of course, today he doesn't do too much about it because he's had to drop all the deprogramming efforts because he got into, shall we say, some difficulty with the military over some of his deprogramming efforts with some of the local boys and sailors and military people and non-military people on the Long Island area. He had quite a reputation, Preston, I mean, and people sought him out. And today he won't do any deprogramming. He's in other areas.